think we're live. So hi everybody, welcome to the first ever digital deep dive webinar series. So we're really excited about this webinar series because it's going to allow us and our guests to really delve into topics that affect businesses, large and small, startups, scale up, those key topics that are going to enable you to be successful. So in future episodes, we're looking at D&I, effective brand management, driving cultural change. But today we're going to be focusing on coaching and how coaching can help you accelerate your team and your team's performance. So before I introduce our wonderful guest, let's check that our chat is working. So where's everyone joining us from? Like, pop into the chat where you're dialing in from. See where everybody's coming in from. London, Manchester, Portsmouth, London, Sheffield, Berlin, Essex. Okay, so we've got a nice spread, which is great, and our chat works, which is amazing. So we've got a really interesting topic today, and we've got an amazing expert joining us who's eagerly awaiting an introduction. But before, actually, I should probably introduce myself. So before we jump in, my name's Ben. So I'm the Director of Growth for a company called the Rec Hub. We are a UK-based European talent acquisition company. So through our couple of products, where are embedded or engaged, we help you grow and scale and power your talent team. So if you want to hear more about what we can do, then by all means, please get in touch. But without further ado, let's welcome coaching expert, longtime friend of the Rec Hub, amazing human being, Mr. Paulo Andre. How are we?
Thanks for having me. Hi everyone. Hi Ben. Great to have this conversation. I have to start immediately by disagreeing with you, if I may. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. The coach is not an expert. If anything, the coach is, is a supporting function to help someone. But we'll get into that, I suppose. In terms of introducing myself, well, name's Paulo. I've been in the tech world, started as a software engineer long ago. And you can see my beard is already like really graying out. So it has been a minute. I've moved to Berlin from my native Portugal in 2015, joined a company here called HelloFresh that I think a lot of people, it became kind of a household name, wasn't at the time. It was a very significant company for me because it was like this rocket ship that was really growing. And that's where all my experiences with like, growing teams, growing organizations, leadership, developing people really came, really started and then developed from there. Ultimately, I led engineering for a couple of other scale-ups. That's where I met the Rec Up, by the way, which was a great experience. We worked across a couple of those companies, always to great success, and more importantly, to great satisfaction and a lot of fun. And ultimately, then I decided that it's time to sort of make a career shift. And I realized that my passion for technology and that whole challenge was not entirely there anymore. And what I really liked was developing people. And when I saw people transforming before my eyes, that was everything. So I thought, how can I do that 100% of the time or close to that, rather than have to do all of this other stuff that I'm no longer like really in love with. Yeah, and that's what I did. A couple of years ago, I jumped into coaching and I never looked back. And today I'm really happy to share some of that experience, what I learned along the way, and have a good conversation with you and with the audience.
Amazing. And what an amazing thing to do, to be able to follow your passion. I guess the age-old adage of if you enjoy what you do, you never work a day in your life, right? So yeah, all credit to you, Paulo, for following that passion. But I guess good place to start off, and I'm going to come out to everybody that's in the webinar. Coaching, I guess it can be quite a subjective term. I think we hear it all the time. It's a bit of a buzzword or a leadership buzzword. So question for everyone joining, in a word or two, what does coaching mean to you? What is your experience of coaching? Because we know it varies massively from business to business and individual to individual. So it'd be interesting to see what people think about coaching as a term. Sure, there's some furious typing out there. So I'm not sure if you can see these, Paulo, but we've got people saying improvement, unlocking potential, support, growth, life-changing, mentor. Amazing. Empowerment, empowering people, improvement. So I guess as a coach, these are the kind of things that you want to hear, right? This is hopefully where we're already aligned to the benefits that coaching can have. And it's interesting that so far they're all very positive. I was expecting maybe a couple of people to have some negative experiences, right? Because both sides of the same coin. There's good coaches and there's bad coaches, isn't there? So I guess let's start right at the beginning. We've asked everyone to define their terms, so thank you very much for doing that. But over to you, Paulo. What define coaching for me? What does this term mean to you?
You know, Ben, it's one of those slippery things that there is no one agreed upon definition. And in fact, I would just say, as a quick aside, that, one of the things about coaching is that anyone can call themselves a coach. And that's sort of a double-edged sword because, on the one hand, you're going to have some bad experiences with coaches that frankly are probably don't know what they're doing, and that may have a negative impact in someone else. But also it's good because at the same time, a lot of people that do have their heart in the right place and want to support others have a vehicle to do so. And ultimately that's my case in the sense that I'm also not accredited or anything. I cannot say officially that I'm a coach, but I that is my activity. That is what I do, not necessarily who I am, right? So in any case, coaching for me, I'll start actually with what it isn't. So coaching is not telling people what to do. Coaching is not about, do this, do that. Why don't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Right? That it's not that. Coaching, one of my favorite definitions of coaching is this: it's giving people a chance to examine what they are doing in light of their intentions. And maybe it's worth just spending like 30 seconds there breaking this down.
Yeah, definitely.
Examining what they are doing in light of their intentions, which begs the question first: what is their intention? What is the intention of my client? What do they want? And that's the whole clarification about goals, objectives, where do we want to be? Ultimately, coaching is about getting from A to B. But first, we need to clarify where we're at, the A, and then where do we want to go and why, the B, right? Um, and then the part about examining why they're doing what they're doing in light of their intentions. Well, the point there is that it's really hard for us to truly observe what we're doing, how we're thinking. There's always a lot on our plates, and we're so used to the way that we do things because it's part of our programming that it becomes like, the good old analogy of water to a fish. It's like, it's just water. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Water? I don't see it. This is just air for me, right? And so with our day to day and our activity and our work, it's the same thing. We have our patterns, we have our programming that comes from our, cultural background, comes from our childhood, comes from all the experiences that we had. And a lot of that stuff becomes automatic and it becomes a habit, and we don't see it for what it is. A coach can help you see that, can help you observe how you're observing the world. And that can be very powerful because it creates perspective. It creates options, it creates alternatives, it creates possibility, and so on and so forth, right? And so that's what I would say coaching is moving you from A to B, helping you clarify what that A and that B is, and then help you examine what you're doing on your day to day, week over week, at work, in life, in light of what those goals are.
Absolutely. And I guess the kind of impartiality of being a coach. Again, we've just had a question come in or a comment come in. A big pitfall to avoid is to try and not impose your view or your worldview on the coachee, right? So that kind of impartiality and that sort of helicopter view must be incredibly important, right?
Absolutely. I think it's a great observation because at the end of the day, this actually brings us a bit to the sort of the key difference between coaching and giving advice. Don't get me wrong, giving advice has a place. I mean, people have been giving advice to each other since forever. It must have value. The issue is, and this happens a lot in the workplace, I see this a lot with my clients, is that if I just bank on my own experience of maybe having traveled some of that path before, and I just jump to advice, I may not actually be helping them because their real problem lies behind the problem that they presented with. And the reality is that if they really understood that, they probably would have solved already. They wouldn't need the coach to support them in that, right? So that's where the inquiry part of coaching and the coach focusing to the point of the viewer there in the comment section, it's really about staying with the process of the conversation and not necessarily with the content of the conversation. Because as a coach, I'm trying to help my client think. I'm trying to help my client see differently, and again, see what they're doing in light of their intentions, as I was saying before. So absolutely, you cannot impose your worldview. You can, but I think in most cases you're going to be doing a disservice to your client.
Of course. And I guess at risk of jumping to the implementation and success before we looked at the strategy, when coaching is done properly, do you see a real tangible link between effective coaching and talent retention or kind of attrition in a business?
Well, that's actually a really good question, Ben, because as a coach, one of the things that I definitely miss is a more tangible understanding of the impact I'm having as a coach and the value that I'm creating. And that's simply because I'm no longer sitting with the people that I'm, collaborating with, that I'm supporting, the way I was when I was an engineering manager, an engineering executive, or whatever, right? So I can't really see that. And ultimately, there are some things you cannot measure that are not very tangible, but you see over time. How I see it very clearly in my clients, for example, in many cases, 2, 3 months later, throughout the engagement, they're showing up in a completely different way. This doesn't happen all the time. Not every time it's like a slam dunk or we can really achieve a transformation, obviously. But in some cases, people that initially presented with really struggling with self-regulation and getting overwhelmed, figured out their own tools and their own compass to, have that regulation that allows them to maintain their energy levels, to maintain, frankly, their sanity in what is usually, very high powered sort of working environments. Um, but yeah, so in terms of more directly answering your question, absolutely, but it goes both ways. And what do I mean by this? So there's a tangible impact on employee retention because when people self-regulate better, when they feel like more empowered, when they start believing more in their own abilities, they tend to not necessarily relax, but they feel more confident. They feel more in control. Their sense of their motivation that comes from a sense of autonomy, that comes from a sense of increased competence, becomes more prevalent for them, becomes more visible. They feel it more. On the other hand, sometimes what you realize, and I have to say this has happened with a few of my clients, is that they realize that the place that they're at is not the place that actually is a fit for them.
Yeah,
And so I guess that plays like it correlates negatively with retention in those cases, right? But at the end of the day, if someone is not aligned with who they are in doing what they're doing and where they're doing with whom they're doing, in the long run, it's never going to work out. So I think it's a net positive that is the outcome.
definitely. And I guess you've touched on an interesting point there. I think when businesses of any size make an investment into coaching, whether that be a time one or a financial one, or I guess any investment, there's always a need or a desire for almost an immediate ROI. It's like, how's it going to affect us? How's it going to affect us tomorrow? I guess this, when you're looking at a return on investment or a return on effectiveness, probably have to look longer scale, right? So implementation of coaching might not affect next week or next month, but it might affect your business in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time, right? Do you
Yeah,
do you,
yeah.
do you see that there is a need, or to some of your clients, kind of, is there an immediacy that they're looking for in terms of results?
Maybe I'm lucky, but the people that I've worked with have been very, um, let's say, patient and very realistic about the impact that coaching can have, and understanding that it takes time for people to develop themselves. It's not an overnight thing. That being said, I think we currently are living in a time where, given the whole economic climate and all of that stuff, where that urgency has been ramped up, there's a bit less patience for
Yeah,
sure. There's an increased push for things like performance and productivity and efficiency and like all of those things that we keep hearing about, which again, don't get me wrong, they are important. But ultimately, people are not machines, and you cannot just tune them up here and there, and all of a sudden off you go, right?
of course.
Um, on the other hand, what I will say is that there's maybe two levels to this, or two sort of dimensions to it. A lot of my clients, I see that because they lacked in the beginning some fundamental skills in terms of managing their time, managing their energy, managing their attention, that's the type of thing that we can have relatively quick gains because it's more about tactical stuff. It's sometimes some reframes even and some tools that they can apply almost immediately that gets them to a significantly better place in how they manage themselves and how they lead themselves. And I do believe that the impact is already visible. It's quite immediately visible in their teams and their organization.
Because
However, go ahead, go ahead.
no, I was just going to, sorry to interrupt, just going to say you often see kind of using a sport coaching analogy.
Yeah.
If a new, looking at football, soccer for everyone outside the UK, there, there's always this new coach bounce. So a new coach comes into a team and you get that kind of little spike of
Right.
energy or activity or productivity. Then it kind of plateaus out and then you see a gradual increase. Do you see that kind of in the personal sort of leadership coaching as well?
I think so. I think that's a great analogy. I think in sports it tends to be kind of like the new manager kind of brings a different approach and there's a breath of fresh air and there's some spike in motivation and so on, perhaps among other things. I think when it comes to coaching, maybe there's an effect of that. You're working with someone else that is different. I would also say that in both cases, the coach also needs to build trust, right? There needs to be a build up of a certain level of communication and empathy and all of those things that breed trust that, ultimately make things take a little bit more time. But yeah, I think the analogy definitely holds because here's the distinction, right? One thing is sort of horizontal development, meaning doing what I already do, how can I expand my skill set within this plane, right? Within this dimension. And then there's more like vertical development, meaning how do I change my perspective? How do I grow to like a different level of sort of consciousness about how I see the team, how I see the organization, how I see leadership in general, how I see the world even, and my interdependence with other people. And so that's the type of thing that takes way longer to achieve. But of course, the multiplier effect, the leverage that has is on a different level.
Definitely. And I guess staying on that topic, and again, we've had another point around in the chat around kind of skepticism and that initial skepticism, or maybe that lack of trust. As a coach going into a new business or to work with an individual, what kind of tactics do you use in order to very quickly sort of build that trust? Because I guess
Yeah.
you go from a point of nothing to quite a quick ramp up. So how do you go
Yeah.
about doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that gives me the opportunity to give a little preface to say that just like employees and employers, there's not always a fit. The same is true between a coach and a client, even if people actually like each other, but the chemistry might not be there. The fit in general is not there, and so there's no point, right? How do you assess the fit then is the question, and how, when it's there, how do you nurture it into a trusting relationship where people can grow from it? So the way I work is that when someone approaches me in some form looking for coaching, let's have a conversation. Let's just go in. I don't obviously charge anything for that, and we'll just have a conversation. And I'll tell you a little story. When I was in the last company I served as a VP of engineering, there was one day I had the chance to have a chat, have a video call with an executive coach in the US who was one of my idols in the coaching world. Someone that I was really like, I really look up to this person. I love their thinking. It really shaped me. There's a lot of backstory there, and I had the opportunity to meet him. And then I shared this with my product partner, the CPO of the company, and I said, "Hey, Kuram, like I'm having this opportunity to talk to this person. How should I approach it? What should I ask? How do I make the most out of this?" And he told me something that was not exactly new to me, but it was eye-opening and it stayed with me forever, which he just said, just connect on a human level. That's all he said. Just connect on a human level. And I realized, yeah, why am I even worrying about this? Why am I trying to maximize and to make this really effective and get the most out of it? It's like just connect on human level and everything else will take care of itself, really. And that's what happened. I had a fantastic conversation with him. I had no script, I had no objectives, I had no outcomes that I was trying to drive. And I loved it. And he's been a very big influence in my career for sure. So building that trust to me is like in that initial conversation that I was talking about, the discovery call, as we call it, some people call it chemistry call. It's really about, I want to live in this person's mind for the next 60 minutes. What are their fears? What are their anxieties? What are they trying to do? Why does it matter to them? Like, I'm just like, I engage my curious mode. And, the more I try to understand them, the more they end up most of the time, in the majority of the cases, connecting with me because they feel like this person cares, and I do, right? And so this really creates like the seeds, like starts to water those seeds. And as Mayank is saying there, active listening is key. It absolutely is. And you know what? Last thing I'll say, and this is both sad and makes me happy at the same time, and you'll see why. I've had clients tell me that, Paulo, I have to tell you, this biweekly session that we have is the only time that I have where someone actually listens to me, where I feel listened to, that what I say actually matters. And of course, makes me happy because I am able to produce that, to create that opportunity for the person. But at the same time, it's like something is broken in our world of work, and we need to do something about this. And that's what I dedicate my life to.
Definitely, and I think that's a very undervalued element, that people to people, peer to peer. I think in a world of AI and automation, that people respond to people, right? That human contact is sometimes all that's needed to initiate a bit of performance or unlock something that wasn't able to be unlocked before. Just somebody, I guess, that active listening piece, somebody taking an interest, caring. Arguably, that's the biggest thing, right?
It 100% is. And there's another thing that is kind of like water to us as fish, which is the way that organizations are structured. The sort of pyramid structure that we have, there's someone at the top, and then there's direct reports, and each person has direct reports as well, and all the way down to the edges of the organization. Um, that lends itself to a lot of machine-like language that is so transparent to us. The input and the output and the outcome and the lever and the driver and the key result, and like all of this stuff that really doesn't help us realize that at the end of the day, when all is said and done, a company is no more than a bunch of people working together for some common goal or goals, right? And I think that sort of environment, that system, is not very conducive to people feeling that they are, in most cases, more than a cog in the machine, right? No wonder. So we need to work actively to counter that. I think, and this is just a quick prediction, that over the next 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to be seeing, I wouldn't say an explosion, but certainly what has been niche for the last couple of decades in terms of organizational structures that are based on the machine metaphor. We're going to see different organizational structures that are much more biology oriented, about how people actually work together and grow together and so on, and achieve goals and build businesses and so on and so forth. So interesting times.
Definitely. So a couple of other points that we've got, and obviously we was having a chat before this, and the term or the phrase of kind of action or motivation. Does motivation feed action, or does action feed motivation?
Mm.
Just a couple of minutes to spend on your thoughts on that, because I think it's a really, really interesting topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really an interesting one, and it reminds me that it's one of those things that in some circles you would call a polarity, right? It's like, is it about action or is it about motivation? Which one comes first? And well, both things can be true. Both can come first, both can come last. What do I mean by this? On the one hand, I do live by the mantra that you know, mood follows action, motivation follows action. If you're dependent on being motivated to take action, you're being dependent, you're making yourself dependent on something that is very flimsy. I think that's the word, right? It's something that is very fickle. Sometimes it's just not going to be there, and that's because you're a human being, right? So you need some sort of a process. In our conversation, I remember I brought up a quote that I love from this sculpture that I came across in a Seth Godin book. Her name, I believe, is Elizabeth King, and she said that process saves us from the poverty of our intentions, right? Which means that if I'm just relying on my intentions, aka my motivation, then that's very poor because it's going to falter. Its willpower is finite. We need to replenish it and we can't count on it. So having a process is something dependable that we can just go back to over and over and over again, and we can improve as well, but that's something that we can depend on. On the other hand, I do think that the role of leadership in large part entails being able to build a vision, create a vision that is compelling, that people can point to and feel and be able to say, that's something that is worth working for. That's something that makes sense. That's something that aligns with who I am. That's something that I really get up in the morning and I'm motivated by to work towards with people that are like-minded. And it's a leader that brings others along and creates other leaders rather than just, having followers. All of that is important, and that to me is the flip side of your motivation and action, because in this case you are creating the motivation that is igniting the action, that is motivating the action. So that's why I think both can be true.
Yeah, amazing. Love that. And in terms of the looking back at kind of the process of coaching and I guess the implementation of it in business, who who kind of typically owns coaching within a business that you're working with? But is it the talent team that own it? Is it the L&D team that own it? Is it the leadership team that own it? Like, how do you see that different, or is it different in different size companies?
I think so. I should say that my experience, also because of my background in engineering leadership, the vast majority, I will say actually all of my clients, let me put it another way, none of my clients are working in big corporations. So my exposure to that is limited to non-existent. So my clients are all in startups, scale-ups, that sort of thing. And I see different situations, but I would say that most of the time it falls into two buckets. The first bucket is when a leader takes the initiative that they need coaching for themselves. They reach out to me, they found me somewhere, and then they have a conversation internally if they want to move forward to get the budget internally for it. But they own their coaching, and so the company is essentially just financing it for them. I even have a case of a client where she's paying out of pocket because she really wanted to have coaching. It's something I discourage people because coaching tends to be more expensive because it's very high touch, obviously. And I always want, and that's the word, I always want the companies to support because that aligns the incentives as well. The other bucket that I was talking about is companies where the CEO or the founder or whatever, they come to me and they say, we have these goals, we have these people, we have like these leaders, and I believe that they would benefit from coaching. They need to level up in this and they need to level up in that, and we have these ambitions and so on. Can you come in and coach them? Right? And there is a different type of engagement because I'm hired by, let's say, the founder, and then I'm coaching different individuals who may or may not be incentivized by themselves to get coaching. Luckily, everyone that I've associated with so far, they're very into the idea of leveling up from A to B, right? As we were talking about. So I haven't faced that resistance where it's like, yeah, I don't care if I'm here or I'm not.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. Luckily, that's not the case. But I would say those are the two main buckets. I will just add to that maybe a pet peeve that I have, and I think this is going to change, is that there's so much going on inside these companies that the ones that do say, yeah, we pay for coaching, great. I think that's already fantastic. But then they kind of disconnect from it, and there's money, quote unquote, money left on the table in terms of the potential of coaching. If their talent team, their people and culture team, HR, whoever is more involved in this, and kind of helps connect the dots in the organization. That tends to not happen. That tends to be like coaching / L&D. Check, we are offering this, and let's move on.
Yeah, and I guess there needs to be, if we looked at it kind of real top down, so a leader comes to you and says, I want better performance from my people, I want you to coach them. There needs to be a willingness, right back to one of the early points, there needs to be a willingness or an awareness from the coachees that they want it or they need it or they can see benefit. I think same as anything, right? If it's being forced upon you, that degree of skepticism or that pushback is going to be greater, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's also, on the one hand, I don't see my job as trying to convince anyone that they should get coaching. Absolutely not, right? In fact, I usually say, like half joking, that everyone needs coaching and nobody needs coaching at the same time, right? Nobody needs coaching because the knowledge is all out there. We live in a golden age of information. In fact, there's too much of it, if you ask me. It's more of a problem of curation, but the knowledge is there, the wisdom is there. Everyone is sharing so many interesting things through podcasts and so on, podcasts and books and blogs and Substacks and whatever else. On the other hand, I do believe that everyone would at least benefit from coaching from this acceleration perspective, right? Especially leaders that are in fast growing companies, fast paced setups, where it's really hard to be growing at the same pace that the company is in terms of the responsibilities and the expectations from your ever evolving role. And I think that's where coaching can really help, because a good coach can help you stay in that learning zone where you feel enough pressure to get you just out of your comfort zone. However, it's not too much pressure that you're just anxious. And when you're anxious and stressed out, you're close to learning. That's not gonna help, right? So I don't know. I think I got off track of your question there. Maybe you can bring me back, but that's what I would say there.
Yeah, no, that perfect. And I guess on that kind of point, and going back to my point around information and the peer to peer and the people element, are there any extra considerations that remote businesses need to take when considering coaching? Because I guess rewind 2 years, 2.5, 3 years, a lot of this probably would have been done in person, right?
Mhm.
But now, does your approach change when it's over a Google Meet or over a Zoom?
It's hard for me to answer this one authentically in the sense that as I said, I became a coach 2 years ago, right? So I'm already like a post-COVID or COVID coach. If I'm not a COVID
Yeah,
coach. This sounds
that should
really
have been
bad.
that should have been the title.
COVID coach. I think that's not an evergreen title, hopefully. Yeah, but I'm from this era in terms of being a coach where everything is actually online, right? So I can tell you that in almost 2 years that I'm doing full-time coaching, I met with the client in person exactly once. Once.
Well,
Yeah. And that was good. That was an interesting experience. Do I miss it? No, not necessarily. From my side, I think, I coach almost 30 people actively right now across different companies. It would not be practical for me to be able to do that while coaching people in person either. So from my perspective, it's extremely helpful that things are remote. Do you have sort of a loss of definition, let's say, because you're not really seeing a full body language, that sort of thing? Absolutely, right? So there's a trade-off, I think, there. That being said, from the perspective of the coachee and the company, I don't see this changing much. In fact, I believe that from a leadership and management perspective, nothing fundamentally changes other than some practical tools and some practical processes to go more asynchronous communication and collaboration. But other than that, the mindset of leadership and management, the caring, the empathy, the relationships, the collaboration, all of that stuff stays intact as you go remote. And so I don't think coaching is an exception when it comes to that.
yeah, amazing. And I guess coaching the same as the majority of processes and interactions in the world now, they need to be able to survive in the digital world, right? So, yeah, it's a slightly redundant question because I kind of know the answer, but it's always interesting to see how this kind of pivot, this kind of digital pivot has affected different industries. But so bringing it back, if there's a few leaders on this or on this webinar, a couple of managers that want to adopt more of a coaching mindset or a coaching methodology without, I mean, obviously, I'm sure you'll welcome questions and people coming to you for advice, but if you wanted to do it internally, what are the first steps or what should people start considering when adopting a coaching mindset?
So to see if I understand your question fully, you mean as a manager, as a leader in a company, how to become more coach-like, how to adopt a coaching mindset in what I already do.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, I love that line of thinking because that's absolutely, I think, essential. And let me tell you why. I think for companies to grow and for people to feel like they are actually part of the story, leaders need to give control. Because the flip side of that, if you don't give control, then you're the bottleneck or you'll become inevitably the bottleneck. And also, you're robbing people from learning experiences in terms of like making their own decisions, making their own mistakes, learning from that. And also, you're going to promote that sense that I'm a cog in the machine because I'm just being told what to do, or I cannot move forward without consulting my manager and like all of that stuff. So if you're in a company that wants to grow, wants to scale along different dimensions, you need to give control. The problem is that giving control is really anxiety inducing for a lot of leaders. Because if I give control, can I trust people that they're going to do the right thing? Are they going to make the same decisions that I would make if I was in the room? And I think it's, navigating this tension that the coaching mindset really helps. I have this thing that I picture in my mind, which is kind of like the coaching flywheel, which is the more you coach your people, the more capable they become, generally speaking, which means that the more you can trust them to delegate stuff to them, the less issues you're going to have, the less firefighting you're going to have, and the less firefighting you have, the more time you have to do, important, not urgent things and more long-term strategic thinking, including more coaching, which kind of closes the flywheel, right? So that's the motivation. That's sort of like why should I care? How to answer your question more directly, how to the biggest thing, well, one of them, Mayank already said there in the chat, it's servant leadership, right? It's really understanding that you're there as a leader to serve them. I come from an engineering background. I don't think engineering is more important than anybody else in a company, but there's one thing that actually sets engineering apart in a software company, which is that's where the rubber meets the road. That's what turns all of the brilliant ideas and all of the plans and hopes and aspirations into actually tangible software that creates value to people, right? And so with that alone in mind, is like, how do you serve them? How do you enable them to do, not to address, their every whim, like, oh, now I want this and oh, I want that. No, 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 no. It's like, what do we need to create to enable great work to happen that not only creates value for our customers, for our users, but also fulfills us and helps us grow? That's the servant leadership part. That's the first thing. Part of the servant leadership is like, you don't need to have all the answers. This is, to me, the most important thing. A lot of people burn out because they put it upon themselves to have all the answers. If they're the leader, they need to know better than anybody else. No, no, no. What they need is to have better questions. If anything, better questions than anybody else. That makes people think, that expands their thinking, and so on and so forth. So once you arrive at that mindset shift, then naturally you start going more into questioning rather than telling, right? Socratic questioning, exactly in the chat there. So how do we inquire more? So ultimately, ideally, you go into a one-on-one with the team member and you're not telling them, you're asking them questions, right? I'll just walk the audience very quickly through a coaching framework that can help you today in becoming more coach-like. And it's the GROW model that some of you maybe have heard. And GROW is an acronym that stands for goal, reality, options, and will. So very quickly, I'll just run through this. You go into a conversation, someone comes up, in the one-on-one, oh, I have this challenge, I have this problem. Instead of like, oh, let's, did you try this? Did you try that? Why don't you do this? What is your goal? What are you really trying to achieve here? Just clarifying that can be the whole thing, right? But let's clarify that. What are you trying to achieve here? What is your goal? If this works, what would that look like? Let's explore that. Okay, now that we have clarity on the goal, we move to the R, reality. What is the reality? What have you tried? What is getting in the way? What is happening? What interactions did you have, etc. Then you move to the, oh, let's explore, let's diverge, and let's explore what options do you have given the reality and the goal that you have. Oh, I can do this, I can do that. Okay, what would it take for you to do that? Okay, great. Okay, out of all of these options, what will you do? Let's go into the last one. And just as a manager, by walking through this, what you achieve is that you get your direct report to think for themselves, most likely to create a lot of clarity that they didn't have before coming into this, and also for them to arrive at their own insight. And more importantly, maybe than all of this, they generated their own options, which means that they will take responsibility for their choice. They were not given the responsibility, like you have to do this. They took the responsibility. That's the power of coaching. Just following this simple framework can do wonders to hold you as a manager from the temptation to give advice, at the same time solving and perhaps more effectively what your direct report really needs.
Amazing. And what a perfect end to that section with a takeaway. So yeah, fantastic advice there, Paolo. And I'm mindful that we're kind of quickly running out. We've talked about this for hours, and we always said we'd like to do a part 2 and a part 3 and some follow-ups on this topic, because I think there's far too much to cram into 45 minutes. But we want to leave some time for questions. So put it back out to the chat. If we've got any questions for Paulo on anything you've heard or anything that you'd like more information on, then feel free to drop it in the chat.
Well, people are writing. I will just say that Rex's observation there, I hadn't been able to read it. I did now. The knowledge is usually in the room. It's a great observation. And also the knowledge is already in people as well. The role of coaching is to help them bring it out. Like all my clients know way more about their day-to-day and what they do than I do.
Yeah.
That's it. I can help them in the process of fleshing it out, but not more than that.
Back to your point right at the start, they're the experts, right? The coach is arguably the expert, and you're just trying to unlock that or facilitate a learning opportunity or a growth opportunity.
100%.
Had a question come in. What is the difference between good coaching and good management? Is there a difference?
Interesting question. I'm going to give a very personal sort of, this is not like a coaching, I'm not having my coaching hat right now or coach hat. My personal observation is that management and coaching are not that far away from the perspective of what I was just saying in your earlier question, Ben. I do think that good coaching and good management are both about getting from A to B. And it's about enabling someone to take that journey and deliver outcomes to create value for whoever they're serving and for themselves. So from that perspective, I don't know if there's a huge distinction there. However, the prevalent definition of what management is, as in, keep the trains running on time and make it efficient and so on, I think then the gap is quite significant, but that's not necessarily how people learn and get better.
Yeah, agreed. And we had a couple along sort of a similar vein to that. Interesting one from Catherine. So we've discussed the coaching and managing, but what about coaching and mentoring? How would you simplify the difference between those? Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a common question as well. Well, I'll start with the mentoring. So the mentoring requires that if I'm a mentor and you're the mentee, it requires that I have in some way significantly walked that path before, right? It allows me the opportunity to say, okay, for that situation that we're talking about here, I had something similar. Here's what I did. Here's what I was thinking. Here's what happened. Here's what I learned. And I'm offering you this. And you can decide what to do with it. You can think about it. You can tinker around with it and see if it applies to your situation. That's very helpful. And there's also an inspirational component to it, right? Because as I said with that other coach that inspires me, is not my mentor directly. I mean, he is, but he doesn't know that he is because it doesn't function as that. But there's an inspirational component to it. And I think that is important from a motivation perspective. Coaching, however, doesn't focus on the content of the conversation per se. It focuses on the process of the conversation between the coach and the coachee or the client. And it's about expanding your thinking. It's about, as I said in the beginning, examining what you're doing in light of your intentions, right? And so it's a lot more about you as the observer putting the spotlight on you, not on my experience. And in that regard, I could be a coach to someone in any area because everyone is a human being, and the process of coaching is a craft in and of itself. So that's what I would say there.
Amazing. And think we've probably got time for one more, and I want to go back to a point that Harry made, because I think this is very applicable to coaches or leaders or managers of pretty much any level. So as a coach or leader or manager, how do you avoid pushing your worldview on the coachee? How do you, I guess, retain that sense of impartiality?
Phenomenal question. The first I'll say is that it's hard, right? And I think one of the reasons why it's hard is because those of us who go into these helping professions like coaching or, even like being a doctor or a caretaker or whatever, is that I think largely it comes from this desire to help other people. And so the tendency to jump to a solution, to tell the other person what they should do to some degree is about alleviating their pain, right? It's about like, oh, I want to solve your problem for you because I really care about you. But the reality is I care about you now, and I also care about you long into the future. So you being able to, you learning how to fish rather than just me giving you a fish is super important. And then there's also a part of like respect. Everyone is different from a neurological perspective. Our brains are all different, and we all learn in slightly different ways. So if I'm pushing my worldview on this person, I'm not respecting the way their brain works in some sense. I may not intend it, but I don't. And I think being aware of that helps me kind of back off and keep me in check about imposing my worldview on this person. Um, and the other thing I will say is that it also is not the way that people in general learn. People need to get to their own insights. So if I'm pushing my insights on them, it might be a brilliant insight, but they didn't come up with it. So it's not going to land in the same way. I'm doing them a disservice in some sense, right? Lastly, to kind of counterbalance this, I would say that sometimes, particularly with extremely, more junior people that have not had the experience, that have not seen a lot yet, they have a lot of unknown unknowns. And so I do think that a coach there, but maybe this is straddling more into the mentor part, really, because the pure coach would not be able to do this. You would, kind of help the other person fill in those unknown unknowns and turn them into known unknowns, and then we can work on them. But I can't know what I don't know. And in there, I think there is initiative that I need to take more of as a mentor, perhaps, to kind of level people up and kind of bootstrap them into a good level that we can build on.
Well, fantastic. And that seems as good a place as any to leave it. As we said, we could talk about this for hours, and there's been some really good questions that we haven't had a chance to get around to answering. So anyone that's obviously signed up, we will share the recording of this along with Paulo, if you'd be happy to answer some of those questions that we haven't got around to answering.
Absolutely.
We'll send that out to everybody. Thank you very much for the questions as well. That's always a great place to end. It shows that everybody's engaged and listening, but also it helps us think about actually how we can structure these going forward and kind of what stuff do people, what do you want to know? What are the things that keep you up at night? So amazing. I think that brings us to time. So everybody out there, thank you very much for joining. Paulo, that has been phenomenal. Some really, really key thought-provoking things and some really tangible takeaways, which I think there's often the issue with webinars that it's a disguised sales pitch, whereas this one definitely wasn't. There were some really, really interesting things to discuss and definitely things that hopefully everyone can go away and think about. So thank you very much. Thank you again to everybody. Keep your eyes peeled for the next webinar. We think it's probably going to be around DE&I, which I know is a really prominent and very hot topic, as it should be. So we will communicate the information on that very shortly. So thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Thanks. Bye.